The Heretic Order by J.J. Lincoln. Chapter 1. Lily Davis killed her first Type B at 13 years old. Now, at 15, she watched her breath swirl in the cold morning air of her first mission. Owen marched past, his battle-worn glare tinged with the hint of paternal pride. It was his eyes that gave it away. Lily maintained her rigid posture as he moved down the line of teenagers in grey battle dress. Lily stood with 3 other apprentices. Florence, her best friend, stood a little taller beside her. Harry and James bookended the group. They had been Lily's teammates for 2 years, and in that time, they quickly became friends. Morgan, a knight like Owen, yawned and stretched, wishing he had a couple less beers the night before. To him, this was just another day at work. When the clock tower chimed 8 bells, the abbot came down the well-worn steps from the refectory with 2 monks on his shadow. The first monk, a short rat of a man, held a large wooden cross. The second monk, with the red mushroom nose of an alcoholic, swung a ball of incense on a chain. Thick smoke of sandalwood and jasmine washed past and intertwined the apprentices. The abbot stopped in front of the 2 knights. He drew the sign of the cross, first in the air, then on their chests with a bundle of rosemary. He stepped past the knights to James, the first of the apprentices and the abbot's son. One of the monks took the bundle of rosemary and the abbot cupped his hands together.
From the light of the Abbey of St. Agatha, you will head towards darkness. Do not let despair cloud your mind. The light of God will be with you, no matter the depths you encounter,
the abbot said. His voice was both soft and loud, comforting yet authoritative. The abbot took his hands away from James and repeated his mantra to Lily. After Lily, he repeated it to Harry and finally Florence, where he stumbled on the word mind and replaced it with mound. It took everything in Florence to keep a straight face. He then walked back up the ancient steps of the largest building in the abbey with the 2 monks following behind. The ceremony was over. It was time to go to work.
I hope none of you have pink eye,
Florence said. Harry and Lily laughed, but James leaned forward in the line and glared at her. Morgan whipped his hand around his back and punched her in the arm.
Right, we better be off,
Morgan said. He walked towards the armoured waste collection vehicle and opened the 20mm thick steel door to the driver's cab and jumped inside. Moments later, the engine groaned a deep metallic rumble and black smoke clung to the ground. Morgan popped his head out the cab and looked back at the acrid smoke. He watched and waited as the smoke turned to a bluish white, and he held a thumbs up to Owen. Owen opened the back door to the rear compartment of the truck and the apprentices climbed in. The truck was called Gramps. It was the oldest in the Abbey's fleet by far. The back compartment had 6 seats for the crew and a methanol flamer turret on top to protect them from flyers. It was a rolling fortress. The vehicle hadn't hauled rubbish for 40 years, but still smelled of mildew and sour milk. A small crowd of knights came to see them off. Jess Anderson, the Abbey's armourer, pushed through the crowd and leaned against the truck.
So, you're off then?
She asked. Her features were too sharp to be called traditionally beautiful, but she carried herself with an elegance that more than made up for it. Her brilliant blonde hair clashed with her utilitarian uniform. Taking my students out on a little field trip, Owen replied. He watched the apprentices take their seats.
Owen, find the silver. People are starting to ask me questions about the stockpile.
Jess looked in the vehicle and smiled at Lily. Her gesture wasn't reciprocated. Is it that bad?
I've been asked to reduce ammunition production and increase the number of blades.
By who?
Brother Wainwright. And it really sounded like an order.
Thanks for letting me know.
Anytime. Be safe out there. Come see me when you're back.
Will do and will do, Owen said as he climbed up a step and closed the door behind him. White streaks of daylight pierced the gloom from the turret above. James tried to hold his breath when he saw the amount of dust swirl in the rays. He held out as long as he could, but, in the end, the best he could do was try not to think about the dust entering his lungs. He buckled himself in on the front left seat and held his palm against an ornate golden crucifix on the wall in front of him. Florence pushed past Harry and climbed the ladder to the turret and squeezed into the old leather gunner's seat. She reached down, turned the valves to pressurize the flamer tank system, and tapped a gauge. When the pressure was in the green, she clicked a button on a small radio receiver twice.
Keep your eyes on the sky, Florence. Flyers could crack this tin can and scoop us out before the sun kills them,
Morgan said in a distorted voice through the radio.
You do your job and I'll do mine.
It was no secret Florence wanted to see action. She loved nothing more than torching the grey freaks and hearing their screams as the sun finished them off. Lily knocked Harry's knee as she left the back seat to move up front. In the middle of the aisle, Owen held onto the turret ladder. The floor vibrated. Then the ancient gearbox caught first gear and the truck jolted into motion. Through thin slits in the side of the compartment, Owen watched the Abbey courtyard passing by, followed by the ancient Abbey walls. When the truck passed the gate, they could see Ravendale, the town a half-kilometre north of the Abbey. The town was wearing morning fog like a wedding dress, with a long train flowing over the surrounding fields. Harry tried to look back at the Abbey, but the small slits in the truck's armour made for poor windows. The initial thrill of leaving on his first mission turned to tedium. Harry started to daydream. He wondered if the old world would be anything like he had imagined every night before drifting off to sleep. He wondered how many vampires were still out there, skulkers, eddies, flyers, and final ones. They were the custodians of Britain now, and he was their guest. He had seen photographs of the old cities but could never understand why anyone would want to live in one. To Harry, it seemed obvious the old world would end with disease. People stacked on top of each other the way they were. In the end, it was inevitable. Harry stared out at a passing service station covered in vines, its fuel turned sour long ago. James checked 2 shells sat snug in his shotgun. They were reloads, of course, the plastic cases replaced by paper by the Abbey's armourer. His 12-gauge over and under had a barrel that stopped level with the forearm. Someone had modified it for close-quarter encounters before he was born. Although it was a small blasphemy to destroy such a beautiful weapon, it made handling it in tight spaces much easier. There was a wonderful simplicity to a shotgun that comforted James. He checked the safety, then tapped every pouch on his vest 3 times to make sure everything was where it was supposed to be. He couldn't help but feel he had forgotten something. In his mind, he made a list of everything that was in each pouch. Flashlight, knife, first aid kit, silver nitrate grenade. He checked again to make sure. After his routine of checking and rechecking, he looked at Lily across the aisle. Her messy blonde hair caught in the Velcro and buckles of her uniform. She took a bobble out from her trouser pocket and tied her hair into a loose ponytail. James stared at her neck for a moment, and his thoughts became unstuck. Lily stared at the steel bulkhead at the front of the cabin. James said something she couldn't focus on. He said it again.
Lily, are you good?
Her mouth was dry. She wiped her lips with a gloved hand.
Yes, sorry, I was thinking.
James laughed and shook his head.
Yeah, you do that too much?
Lily gave him a polite smile. She was in no mood for small talk, and she went back to her thoughts. She regretted making the second cup of valerian tea that morning. Her mind blurred. She had picked the herbs from a small pasture north of Ravendale, instead of her usual spot near the river. She wondered if the volcanic soil near the town that made the plant's medicinal effects stronger. Before the outbreak, it would have taken them an hour to drive from Ravendale to Leeds. Now it took the best part of the morning. Morgan struggled to maneuver around the broken-down cars and trucks, like skeletons littering the motorway. Lichen covered some, which made them difficult to make out from the overgrown grass verges on the sides of the road. Through trial and error, Morgan had memorized a route around the abandoned cars and trucks, but patches of thick morning fog made him question his memory. Owen meditated. He wondered how low the silver stockpile had gotten for the abbot to order his mission. Jess seemed scared, and he couldn't tell if it was because of the silver or the thought of him going outside the abbey walls. Rumours were always going around. It was a byproduct of the lack of news of the outside world. For every untouched haul of silver, there was an untouched haul of Snickers bars in a solar-powered refrigerated truck. For every sighting of a final one, were 2 for UFOs. At 11, they were a couple kilometres outside of Leeds. Owen made his way to the front of the compartment and kicked a rucksack in the aisle. He glared at his apprentices to find the owner. Harry snapped out of his daydream, and in a panic, he smacked himself in the face with the night observation device in the top flap of his bag. White-hot pain pulsed from his right eyebrow. "Right, team," Owen said. He had a natural authority that made it impossible not to listen. The apprentices stopped what they were doing and turned to him. Florence lay on her stomach on the turret platform. Harry rubbed his brow, hoping nobody saw the tears he was trying to keep at bay. "Our mission is to investigate a rumour of a vault containing silver bars," Owen said.
How reliable are these rumours?
James asked. "We have 2 separate sources of human intelligence, one from Knight Campbell and one from a raider we interrogated years ago," Owen replied.
Years ago, that doesn't sound good. Are we sure it's still there?
Lily asked. We're not sure of anything. Morgan will park the truck a kilometre from the centre. Knight Morgan and I will go on foot for a recce. Florence, you're in charge while we are gone, Owen said.
If you're not back by dark.
Florence asked. Come find us tomorrow. Put a silver bullet in each of our heads, he replied. Lily furrowed her brow. Owen noticed and he winked at her. Lily hated gallows humour. Joking about terrible things was only testing fate.
What's the plan for tomorrow?
Harry asked. At sunrise we drive to the vault. It could be a long day of moving cars and debris out the way. When we get there, we'll be handballing anything we find into the truck, Owen said. He gave the crew a quick salute and they reciprocated. Knight Morgan took the exit at junction 44 and carried down the road for 15 minutes. The refurbished brakes squealed as the truck stopped. Morgan gritted his teeth and hoped nothing broke. Out the thin slits in the right side of the truck, the apprentices could see a large red brick church. Owen held up a finger and everyone listened. When he was satisfied, he unbolted the back door and they all jumped out. The morning fog had cleared and wispy clouds promised a warm day ahead. James looked at the church and pulled a crucifix from around his neck and kissed it. Lily rolled her eyes and stuck her finger in her mouth like she was trying to make herself puke. Florence grabbed her rifle and climbed down the ladder from the turret. At the bottom she realized her safety was off and she quickly clicked it on. Owen was a stickler for weapons safety. Florence, everyone stays by the truck. If you hear anything, get inside and bolt the door, Owen ordered.
Got it,
she replied. The apprentices saluted the knights again. Lily stepped forward to hug Owen but remembered their relationship was now strictly professional. She nodded to him, then watched as the two knights set off jogging. Owen swept the abandoned cars with his rifle as he went. They were now in occupied territory. Instinct had taken over. He had seen more than enough knights become complacent, and in the end, they only had themselves to blame. When the knights disappeared around a bend, the apprentices climbed on top of the truck and relaxed in the early summer sun, though it was still a little chilly. After half an hour, Harry sat up and blew out from his lips, then tapped his knuckles against the steel roof of the vehicle. He was promised adventure, and this seemed like the opposite. He looked over at the church and wondered what was inside.
Florence, I'm going to explore the church,
Harry said.
Fine with me, try not to get killed.
Florence replied. James was sat with his legs crossed and watched the road behind the truck for danger.
Owen said stay with the truck,
James said without turning around.
James, it's fine. I'll be 5 minutes,
Harry said. He pushed his hazelnut fringe off his face and put on his high-cut helmet. He lowered himself down from the roof and jumped from the last step. James tapped his pouches. Everything was where it should be, so why did he feel so wrong?
What if the church is full of Type Bs?
James asked. Florence sat up and lowered her large 70s-style sunglasses.
James, are you scared of a couple vampires jumping out at you?
Well, yes, obviously,
James replied.
I'm in charge and Harry can have a look in the church if he wants,
Florence said and stuck her tongue out at him. James looked down at the cracked tarmac and sighed. Then he picked his helmet off the roof of the truck.
Don't worry, James, I can handle a skulker,
Harry said. He held up a black 3-shot semi-auto shotgun and shook it for effect. The holographic scope wobbled on its duct-taped mount. Florence looked at the pale teenager. His wavy brown hair had fallen forward, even with his helmet holding it back. He reminded Florence of her youngest brother. Well, before a flyer got him.
James, you better go with him. Besides, there may be relics inside,
Florence said. James looked at the church and nodded. The monks are always looking out for ecclesiastical relics.
Fine, I'll get your 6, Harry,
James said. He slipped on a stab-proof coif over his short blonde hair. James climbed down from the truck's roof. They crept up the path and hopped over the rusted-shut gate to the churchyard. Florence lay back down, but Lily watched the boys disappear behind an overgrown hedge. She worried something would happen to them, but the Valerian dulled her worry, so she watched the clouds instead. James reached the church door first and stood with his ear to the weather-beaten oak. At one time, the ornate door would have looked odd against the industrial red brick building. Now, the rotten door looked right at home. James was confident nothing was moving in the church and slung his shotgun, then heaved the oak door open. The hinges were unrelenting, but after several sharp pulls, it opened. Harry and James stepped back as the smell of wet mud and mildew escaped from the church. They both aimed their shotguns, ready to fire, but nothing emerged from the gloom. Harry entered first and James followed behind. The interior of the church was lit in every colour from the large stained glass windows. Something smashed one of them long ago, and a single white beam lit up the back pews. It took Harry a moment to realise the pews were full of people. He froze. Could they be vampires? No, the light. He scanned the room and noticed the blackened carpet at the pews. The worshippers had been here for a long time.
Typo?
James asked.
Yeah, puddles.
Harry replied. He gestured at the floor with the barrel of his shotgun. James dry heaved.
Don't say that. I hate it when people call them that.
The Knights of the Abbey had slang words for all sorts of strange things. There were names for the different types of vampires. Skulkers were the most common. They liked to hide in shadows and ambush passers-by. They were only dangerous at night or in confined spaces. Flyers, well, they fly, of course. Eddies are the great big strong bastards that can punch through walls and chest cavities like cardboard boxes. They were named after a legendary British powerlifter, who it was rumoured was one of the first to turn that way. The final few were the vampires of old myths. Everyone knows a guy who has seen a final one, but nobody seems to have seen one themselves. Puddles were people with type O blood who died in the initial outbreak. All the people on Earth with type O blood became puddles, every single one. That's 3.2 billion people wiped out in a few months. A puddle became a flood, but there was no olive branch. They were called puddles because the human body is 60% water, and all that liquid must go somewhere when you die. Knight Campbell had a tale about a hospital he broke into to find medicine a year after the outbreak. At first, he thought he was wading through sewage. Campbell would try to describe the smell created by the thousands of dead upstairs. Every time he told the story, he created a more disgusting simile. This was usually met with laughter and a free beer or two. Harry peered over the back pew at a couple holding a brown bundle. He examined the material and could see faded images of little sailing boats on the fabric. He averted his eyes but couldn't help thinking of his little sister, safe on his family farm.
They knew they were dying. They had nowhere else to go.
Harry said. James walked down the aisle, making sure not to disturb any of the corpses in their eternal prayers. Harry and James couldn't help looking back at the faces as they walked. Skulls with black eyes watched them in return.
I hope my faith doesn't waver when it's my time,
James said. He was smiling, like he saw some divine beauty in the scene. Harry didn't say anything. James looked back to check he was still there. Harry had stopped and was staring at the ceiling. His face was twisted in fear. James looked up and almost fell backwards. Hanging from the rafters of the church were 9 flyers in their winged cocoons. Their black-veined wings covered their thin, pale bodies beneath. Their long hair cascaded down, obscuring their faces. It was a miracle they hadn't awoken. Without saying a word, James made his way back the way he came. Harry shouldered his weapon, and James shook his head and held out his left hand, palm down. Harry looked away from the flyers at James and could see the fear in his eyes. The 2 boys took measured steps as they walked towards the door. Each time they brought a foot down, the solid timber floor threatened to scream. It was at this point they noticed most of the corpses were not decomposed enough to be type O's. They cursed themselves for their lack of experience in the field. The flyers must have brought the bodies back to feast on. Flyers prefer their meals warm and wriggling. Unlike other vampires, flyers don't try to infect their victims. Instead, they tear them limb from limb and suck out the marrow. Their lack of opposable digits gave them terrible table manners. Harry and James made it to the doorway, and when they were within arm's reach of the door, they heard movement above. It sounded like a bedsheet on a washing line, blowing in the wind. James looked up as a flyer stretched out its wings. He could see its face and body. The flyer was a woman before it turned, but now it was a fetid blue-grey and missing its left breast. The creature folded its wings back and carried on sleeping. James looked back down at Harry, who had already disappeared out the door.
Bastard,
James said in a whisper that sounded like a shout to his terrified mind. The cool air hit James as he left the church. He didn't say anything to Harry as they jogged down the path to the truck. Harry's face was now a pale green, and James pushed past him to jump over the gate. When they got back to the truck, Lily and Florence were still sunning themselves.
Find anything good?
Florence asked. James cleared his throat.
it's a flyer's nest.
Florence sat up and took off her sunglasses.
Shit, how many?
She asked.
9. Could be more in the back.
Harry replied. He threw his hands behind his head like he had been given some terrible news. Florence looked past the boys to the church.
We sit inside the truck until Owen and Morgan are back.
None of the apprentices objected. Lily knew she had been right to worry. According to the faded brochure, the vault was 3 miles from the truck. The chance of meeting any hostiles or anyone alive at all was slim to none. They jogged in a silent city. Owen winced every time his right foot hit the ground. 30 years of soldiering had taken a toll on his knees, but the right had always been worse. The quicker they found a route, the better. Owen didn't want to waste time moving cars out the way of the truck, only to find there was no vault. He unfolded the brochure given to him by Knight Campbell and checked a small map on the back. 2 weeks ago, Knight Campbell rode into the abbey on his dark grey Shire horse Bess. He jumped off with unnatural agility for a man of his size and handed a faded piece of paper to one of the monks. Brother Wainwright scurried away, like a rat into the darkness of a doorway. Campbell came to Owen and they both stood over his apprentices who lay in the mud, struggling to complete press-ups in their battle dress. "What is so important you need to interrupt our physical training, Knight Campbell?" Owen asked with a smile and a hug for an old friend.
"Oh my goodness, have you lost count of how many the Weans have done,
Campbell said. "How many has it been, Harry?" Owen asked.
20-something.
"No, that doesn't sound right. It was 2, 3, 4. Yes, everyone keep going. 5, come on. Florence, don't give Harry that look."
"It's the mother lode,"
Campbell said. "Ah yes, another legend of a secret vault filled to the brim with silver. How many times have we chased this wild goose before?" Owen asked.
"Not this time, Owen."
"And there's a cure at Porton Down," Owen said. Campbell removed a thick pair of leather riding gloves.
"We trapped an eddy in an office block on the outskirts of York. When we got to the top of the building, we only found a few skulkers. Bloody thing must have slipped out the back. What I did find, however, was a great big beautiful mahogany desk. I used my delicate wee hands and ripped the locked drawer from the frame. Inside was a leaflet. 'Store your wealth with Eames and Partners Secure Storage,'"
Campbell replied. He emphasized his words by wafting his huge hands in the air. "Probably picked clean decades ago. Right, everyone, you can stop now, jog to Ravendale and back," Owen said. The apprentices stood up, tried to wipe off some of the mud, and then jogged out the abbey gate towards the town. As they left the abbey, Florence shoved Harry and he flipped over a low wall, landing on his back.
"I rode Bess where the leaflet said to. The front of the building was rubble, taken out by a bus. Nobody's getting in there. Nobody except us and a few hydrocharges,"
Campbell said. Owen kicked the courtyard gravel. "It's time to test my apprentices. I hope the abbot signs off on this little treasure hunt of yours," Owen said. The road to the vault was completely blocked. Morgan nudged a desiccated corpse with the barrel of his rifle. Some of the bodies wore sun-bleached military fatigues, others were civilians. Owen turned over a white metal sign, then threw it away. "Military checkpoint," he said.
"Let's double back, find another route,"
Morgan said. Owen looked up at the black windows of the buildings looming over the street. He hated cities. He knew something or somebody was always watching him from above. Although clashes with dangerous survivors were a thing of the past, Owen couldn't shake years of habit formed surviving outside the abbey walls. Owen had often wondered about the groups of survivors scattered across the country. Raiders could only survive for so long. Survival must give way to society. Owen more than anyone knows how easy it is to live by the gun. The life of a hired gun is fun, but usually short. "Show me the map," Owen said. Morgan pulled his pack over his head. It released it from his body armor with magnetic buckles.
"Hang on, it's in here somewhere."
He handed a crumpled map to Owen. Owen tried to smooth out the map and shook his head at Morgan. "Okay, let me see here," he said and looked around the street. "The roadblocks will carry on for a few streets over. We should turn right. See up here. Then we flank around to the vault from the north," Owen said. He handed the map back to Morgan, who scrunched it down into his backpack. Owen pretended not to notice. The two men wandered the streets all morning in search of the easiest route. The bramble of steel that once had been cars was unpassable. They returned to the first road and the roadblock. It was a quaint residential street with large Victorian townhouses. Morgan scratched his cheek. His silver stubble clashed against his deep black hair. He walked up to the wall blocking the road. It consisted of 2 layers of concertinas. Each layer was a meter high and spanned the street from garden wall to garden wall. On top of the wall was razor wire strewn with rags. Bones littered the floor and the razor wire. Morgan pulled out his knife and stabbed one of the blocks. A stream of sand shot out like liquid.
"I reckon we can shift this if we had some cheap labor,"
Morgan said. Owen climbed up the steel mesh cages and looked over the barrier. It's clear this side. Lots of bodies, though, he said.
Nothing Gramps can't handle.
Morgan replied. Owen patted Morgan on the shoulder and set off walking back to the apprentices. Morgan checked the windows above. He couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched either. The walls of the truck had 6 fold-down beds, 3 on each side. Knight Morgan sat on one of the chairs drinking from a battered silver hip flask. Owen lit a row of candles on a shelf. The apprentices lay on their bunks reading or writing in their journals. Florence was already fast asleep. Harry stared at the underside of the bunk above and wondered about the people in the church. Their bloodlines ended, with nobody to remember their lives. He had long since come to terms with the reality of the world. He hoped his family would remember him, but in this world nothing was certain.
Knight Davis?
Harry asked. He rolled over to face the aisle. I've told you, when we are downrange, call me Owen, he replied.
Do you remember what it was like before the outbreak?
A little. I was 8 when we escaped from Manchester. I remember my dad putting the news on and my mum looking worried. I remember not long after I saw my first skulker, Owen said. Morgan passed his hip flask to Owen. He took a swig, and the sharp taste brought him out of his memories. He shook his head. Brother Andrew's homemade whiskey never went down smooth. How about you, Harry? You want to know about me? What about you? Owen asked.
What do you mean?
Why would the son of a sheep farmer want to be a knight? Owen asked.
I don't know.
Don't give me that shit. Morgan, why did you become a knight? Owen asked.
Help 'em that need it, kill 'em that need it,
Morgan replied.
Oh my God.
Lily laughed.
Come on, Harry, do tell.
James asked. Harry looked down over his bed at James in the bottom bunk.
I guess. I want to see if the world is like I dreamed about as a kid.
Harry replied.
Also, I hate the smell of sheep.
Owen nodded. Okay, that's more like it. James, I'd ask you the same question, but I know it's because of your daddy issues, Owen said. Lily and Harry laughed.
Fuck off, sir,
James said. Fair enough, I don't want to know why Florence loves killing as much as she does, so that leaves you, Lily. Why did you want to become a knight? Owen asked. Lily looked at her hands.
You would come back from missions and everyone in the pub wanted to hear stories of your adventures. They idolised you. I wanted that.
Owen exhaled. So you want to be the hero held aloft on people's shoulders. I hope it'll make you happy, Owen said. She nodded, confused at his tone. Harry and James felt the atmosphere change too. Their love only goes so far. You still come home to a cold bed, aching and shivering at the things you've seen, Owen said. They sat in silence for a few minutes, then Owen climbed into bed.
Sir?
Harry asked. Owen grumbled and turned around in his bed in an exaggerated manner. What? I'm trying to sleep.
There was a flyer's nest in the church.
James lay in silence. How many? Owen asked.
9. It could have been more.
Harry replied. Owen sighed. I'll add it to our to-do list, Owen said. Morgan brewed a pot of black tea, then decanted it into aluminium mugs. They all sipped the affirming beverage on their bunks and eased into the hard day ahead. Most of the other knights thought the prototype rifles were the best find from the old military base. Owen thought it was the several tons of freeze-dried tea bags. The compost of civilization is what he called it. Lily couldn't figure out if that was a good thing. Owen checked everyone's gear was correct and made sure their weapons were on safe. He didn't want to catch 8 ball bearings in his arse from one of his students. Florence presented her rifle after the others' shotguns. Owen removed the magazine and pulled the bolt handle a few times. He dry-fired the rifle and reinserted the mag. It was an old army model, not powerful enough for eddies, but fine enough for skulkers. Morgan got out the back, poured out the remains of tea from the kettle, then walked around to the driver's cabin. Florence climbed up the small ladder to the turret. The truck came to life easier than the day before. Gramps was temperamental, especially on cold mornings. Owen could relate. Morgan started maneuvering around the obstacles until he slowed at the first car blocking the road. The engine roared as he pushed the rusted hatchback out of the way.
She moved easy,
Morgan said into his radio. Owen couldn't hear over the static. The truck's armor was thick enough to protect it from eddies, but blocked the radio signal. Morgan could see the military checkpoint ahead, and he stopped the truck at a junction in case of ambush. He left himself multiple escape routes. He turned the engine off. Owen opened the back door and the apprentices followed him to the front of the truck. Morgan pulled a battered steel toolbox from the driver's cabin and placed it on the ground. Harry kneeled, picked up a skull and examined it.
The maxilla is missing. The nasal cavity extends below, where the top teeth should be. All these bodies were skulkers.
Harry said. He let the skull fall from his hand. The walls look solid, but it's only sand in big bags. We need to use bolt cutters on the steel cages, then cut the bags, Owen said. Morgan climbed up the wall and started to cut the wire cage holding the sandbags in place. The apprentices grabbed spades attached from the side of the truck and waited. Morgan clipped a face off the first concertina and threw it behind with a clatter. Harry picked it up and threw it into a front garden, overgrown with weeds where flowers once would have been. Morgan jumped down from the wall, and Owen cut the sandbag in a long horizontal swipe using his tomahawk. The sand poured out like water, and the apprentices hurried to grab spadefuls and dump it in the gardens on either side of the street. They were soon overwhelmed, and the sand started making dunes in the road. Morgan sat on top of the wall with his rifle ready and sipped from his hip flask.
Are you going to help or just get drunk?
Florence asked.
Don't talk to me. I'm taking my guard duty very seriously,
Morgan replied. Florence got a spadesful of sand and threw it up into Morgan's leg. He felt they were being watched from somewhere. He stared into the windows above. He looked to the windows on the south side of the street, and sure enough, a face was staring back. Morgan shouldered his rifle and looked through the 6X Vortex scope. It was a little girl in a pink dressing gown. Her hair covered her face, and Morgan couldn't see if she was missing the flesh under her nose. His finger started to pull the trigger, then he released the pressure. She might be human. He couldn't live with that.
Owen, we're being watched. A little girl by the looks of it,
Morgan said. He pointed to the window and the girl stood staring. Vampires? Owen asked. Morgan looked up with his scope again.
Shit, I can't tell.
Owen sighed and checked his watch. Morgan, cut the next cage. Flo, take Overwatch. I'll check it out. I can't leave her up there, Owen said. He unslung his rifle, then pulled the bolt back enough to check a round was chambered. He climbed up the wall and saw the house with a faded blue door. The girl had disappeared from the window above. The house was 3 floors high with a separate double garage, and an old red Volvo was parked on the drive. Owen thought for a moment. He knew he should have had backup. He looked at the growing dune of sand and the frantic apprentices running back and forth. There wasn't time. Owen lowered himself down from the wall onto a large pile of bones. He slipped down towards the front gate and used the momentum to kick through the decayed iron lock. He waded through thigh-high grass and stopped at the front door. He put his head to it and listened. The rhythmic thump of his heartbeat made it difficult to hear anything on the other side of the door. He stepped back and pulled out a thin leather case from a pouch on his body armor. He flipped the case open and pulled out 2 thin strips of metal. The angled piece went into the lock first, then a lockpick that looked like a small saw. He pushed and pulled the lockpick while applying torque with the angled piece. The lock clicked and he turned the handle. Owen stepped into the entrance hall with a leaf-strewn tiled floor. Florence looked over at the house. Owen had disappeared into the gloom of the doorway. He swept the entry room with his rifle as he went towards a door and peeked around with his rifle canted. At this range, the optics were useless. He aimed with instinct. Owen clicked on the small torch attached to the M-lock rail system covering the barrel and aimed it up the stairs. Nothing, just shadows dancing in his torchlight. He checked downstairs first. Light streamed in through broken windows in every room. The house was a vampire trap. They couldn't be downstairs during the day. Who knows how many were upstairs? If the spectre he had seen in the window didn't remind him of Lily, he would have left. The house felt wrong. His hands were shaking. He came back to the entrance hall and maneuvered his weapon around the door frame and aimed up the stairs again. He listened for a moment, then put his foot on the first step. It creaked. They always creak. If anything was in the house, they knew he was coming. He climbed the stairs to the first floor and aimed up to the second. He crept down a hallway and pressed his ear to a closed door while keeping his weapon light aimed towards the stairs. He heard nothing in the room but knew a skulker could be lying dormant somewhere. He pushed the door with his left hand. The door opened into a second living room. Christ, these people had the life. Owen checked the corners of the room. A thick blue curtain covered the window, and he walked slow but smooth into the room. It was empty except for a pigeon skeleton, surrounded by grey feathers. Owen made his way out the room and looked down the stairs, in case something had snuck up behind him. He walked up the stairs to the top floor and listened to the closest door, and immediately heard the girl breathing. Owen looked down and could see black hair creeping from under the door. He stepped back and looked to the stairs. He could leave and never find out what was on the other side of the door. Shit, what if she isn't infected? He breathed in, then exhaled a long, lingering breath. He quivered. "Sweetie, can you open the door for me?" Owen asked. The girl didn't answer. Her hair had disappeared from under the crack. "I need you to move back from the door. I'm going to kick it down," he said. Owen stepped back, then bounded into the door and kicked it open. The door swung back on its hinges, and Owen moved through the bedroom to the opposite wall. He spun around and scanned the room with his rifle. The girl had disappeared. Owen stopped and listened. He heard her raspy breath but couldn't figure out where it was coming from. He walked over to the window and tore down a curtain. Outside, they were moving the sand from the second concertina. He heard an inhuman scurrying behind him and dropped to his knees, then bent down to look under the bed. His rifle was ready as he leaned. He held onto a brass bed knob. His knees were too stiff to get down low enough. The girl burst out from under the bed, laughing and flailing towards him. She managed to get under the large suppressor and push his rifle upwards. Owen grabbed the girl by her neck and held her out at arm's length. She shook like a rabid dog and snapped at the air as she tried to bite him. She must have been dormant for some time. Skulkers can stand in place for years, even decades, until some unlucky bastard wakes them up. Most skulkers wear rotten clothes, some wore nothing at all. Britain's forests are full of them, camouflaged under decades of moss. This skulker wore cream pajamas and a fluffy pink dressing gown. She reminded Owen of Lily when she was 6 years old. The apprentices stopped shoveling, their gaze drawn up at the sound a window shatter above. A little body swelled and burst before it hit the ground in a puff of pink pus and bones. A small skull skidded across the asphalt. Lily saw Owen in the window. He looked down at what he had done. She was in shock at the sudden brutality of her father, a side she had never truly seen before. Owen came back down to the street and grabbed a spade. Morgan jumped down off the wall and went into the empty house to scavenge. Owen looked at Lily for a moment, then turned away. "Back to work, everyone," Owen said. He started throwing spadefuls of sand onto one of the piles now level with the garden wall. 3 hours later, the apprentices lay in the sand as Owen handed them water in glass bottles. They popped the corks and gulped it down. Owen stared down the street in the direction of the vault. There was 7 hours of daylight left, but the buildings blocked the sun and he wanted everyone in the truck by 6. Beyond the wall, 2 cars blocked the road, but it wouldn't take more than an hour and a half to move each vehicle. "Everyone back in the truck. Grab something to eat while you have a chance," Owen said. The apprentices groaned and helped each other out of the dirt. Gramps' ancient diesel engine roared to life up and they drove for 15 minutes. A grey Land Rover Defender squatted, rusted shut to the road. Morgan rubbed his chin and walked around the vehicle. He lowered himself down so he was flat on his stomach, and he looked under the vehicle.
"No way we can push it,"
Morgan said. "What's the plan, Morgan?" Owen asked, arms folded.
"If we lighten it enough, should be able to roll it."
Harry pulled on the passenger side door. It opened. He examined the hinges.
"Morgan, do you have any Torx bits in your toolkit?"
Harry asked.
"Yes, a pretty good set."
Morgan replied.
"If we take the doors off and smash the windows, we could take 150 kilos off the weight easy. It won't take long."
If we take an angle grinder to the engine mounts, it will drop out the bottom. Wait. We would need to unbolt the gearbox first.
Lily said. Owen patted Lily and Harry on their backs and squeezed them into him. "Good suggestions, guys. Get at it," he said. Morgan laughed.
"Christ, Owen, I know she's your daughter, but you don't need to prove anything by treating them hard,"
Morgan said, and went to find his toolbox. "Not trying to prove anything," Owen said. They cleared the largest obstacles from the road. Morgan helped with the cars by pushing them out of the way with the truck, but some seemed to have fused to the tarmac over time. When they found one of these anchored vehicles, the only option was to clear the pavement instead, which meant cutting down telephone pylons with the axe tied to the side of the truck. It was slow work. They arrived at the bank mid-afternoon. Morgan switched off the engine and Gramps went to sleep.